أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today, after a long hiatus, alhamdulillah, we resume our course of lectures on René Guénon's seminal text, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Many months ago, we left off in chapter 13, and so we will pick up things today from chapter 14 of the same book. Chapter 14 is entitled Mechanism and Materialism, and this is a further elaboration and development of the themes introduced in chapter 13, which is entitled The Postulates of Rationalism. So 14 and 13 are two very closely related chapters. So I have already spent a lot of time talking about the conception of science that emerged with Descartes. I already spoke about this at great length in the previous lecture. And basically, what Guénon would like to focus on in chapter 14 is the dominance of mechanism and the mechanistic worldview, or the mechanistic approach to science in this chapter. And it is this approach which renders modern science to be a caricature of true scientia. And he further argues at length in chapter 14 for a direct filiation between mechanism and materialism. However, it would not be out of place before we proceed any further to recapitulate and repeat the definition of rationalism, because rationalism is connected with materialism. In fact, Guénon will argue that, and has argued already in the previous chapter, that materialism really emerges as a direct consequence of rationalism. So on page 90, Guénon describes rationalism as follows. Rationalism in all its forms is essentially defined by a belief in the supremacy of reason, proclaimed as a veritable dogma, and, this is the key point, and implying the denial of everything that is of a supra-individual order, notably of pure intellectual intuition. We spoke at length about the concept of aql in Islamic thought and other traditional civilizations in the previous lecture. Guénon continues on in this paragraph and he says, and this carries with it logically the exclusion of all true metaphysical knowledge. That's a very important point. So rationalism rejects anything of the supra-individual order. And further, in chapter 13, on page 89, the previous page, he says, the second paragraph at the bottom, let it be recalled then that rationalism, properly so called, goes back to the time of Descartes. And it is worthy to note that it can thus be seen to be directly associated right from its beginning with the idea of a mechanistic physics. So you could really say that chapter 14 picks up then from that sentence. So now when we go to chapter 14, the opening sentence of chapter 14 is, the earliest product of rationalism in the so-called scientific field was Cartesian mechanism. Materialism was not due to appear until later, for as explained elsewhere, the word and the thing itself are not actually met with earlier than the 18th century, besides whatever may have been the intentions of Descartes himself. And it is in fact possible, Guénon concedes, by pursuing to the end the logical consequences of his ideas to extract from them theories that are mutually very contradictory, there is nonetheless a direct filiation between mechanism and materialism. This is the point. This is what he wants to argue for here. In other words, that Cartesian mechanism has a direct filiation with in other words, a direct relationship with materialism. In other words, the mechanistic physics introduced by Descartes directly leads to materialism. He talks further in this paragraph about how there are certain, perhaps ancient antecedents to mechanistic and materialistic doctrines, namely the atomistic conceptions associated with the names of the ancient Greek figures of Democritus and Epicurus, if I've pronounced them correctly. In other words, he says that these doctrines can be qualified as mechanistic, but their conceptions, he says, are often wrongly looked upon as the earliest form of materialism. For materialism implies, above all, the modern physicist's notion of matter, and at that time this notion was still a long way from having come to birth. This is very important. The modern physicist's notion of matter. We will talk more about this as we move further. Guénon also says on the same page, the truth is that materialism merely represents one of the two halves of Cartesian dualism, the half to which its author had applied the mechanistic conception. It was sufficient thereafter to ignore or to deny the remaining half, or what comes to the same thing, to claim to bring the whole of reality into the first half in order to arrive quite naturally at materialism. So we need to say a few things about Cartesian dualism in a moment, but let's just continue Guénon's discourse a little bit. Guénon has at times a positive view of some of the doctrines of Leibniz. In other cases, of the doctrines of Leibniz or the views of Leibniz, he spares no. He has no kind words for Leibniz's very puerile understanding of Chinese metaphysics, the Yi Jing we spoke about in the previous lecture. But he in other cases he has a more positive understanding of things which Leibniz said. And to be fair, Leibniz did have some important insights, and one of those is his opposition to Descartes and the followers of Descartes in trying to demonstrate the insufficiency of mechanistic physics, which by its very nature, Guénon says, that Leibniz said, cannot take account of anything but the mere surface nature of things or the outward appearance of things, and it's not really capable of offering even the smallest explanation of the true essence of things. Now, the example that he adduces here, page 97, this is seen to be the case even when an example as simple as that of movement is taken. Though movement is ordinarily thought of as being more completely explicable than anything else in purely mechanical terms. So if you study modern physics in high school, for example, or at the university level, one of the first things you learn after vectors is what's called mechanics. And in mechanics, we have statics and dynamics. So you have something that isn't moving, but it's under tension or compression or loading of some kind. And then you have things that are moving. And that's what we call mechanics. And in the area of dynamics, obviously you study things that move. And you have translational motion and you have rotational motion. And these things are described in very simplistic, I would say, mathematical terms. There's mathematical abstractions. There are certain equations. These are well known to anyone who has taken high school physics. So these equations just describe motion, for example, but they don't really get to the essence of the matter. You have to understand that for their predecessors in the Middle Ages, in the scholastic period, and even before that in the Islamic world, motion, in Arabic, al-haraka, in Persian, harkat, and in Latin, motus, really meant change. It wasn't just motion. So, Okay, so we have to read the sentence again. We took too long away from the sentence, so let's go back. It says, this is seen to be the case even when an example as simple as that of movement is taken, though movement is ordinarily thought of as being more completely explicable than anything else in purely mechanical terms. But any such explanation, says Leibniz, is only valid so long as movement is not regarded as involving anything other than a change of situation, the change of situs, the change of place. That's it. From this limited point of view, it is a matter of indifference when the relative positions of the two bodies change, whether the first is regarded as moving in relation to the second or the second in relation to the first, for there is a complete reciprocity between the two. But it is quite another matter when the reason for the movement is taken into account. So, by way of example, there's a person whose name is also closely associated with the development of the calculus and therefore with Leibniz, and that, of course, is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton in the Principia Mathematica, the principles of mathematics of the natural order, he develops his laws of motion, and he also has a theory of gravitation. How? Tell me how. I do not dispute that the heavenly bodies move. How do they move? Tell me how. So Newton's universal law of gravitation is a development of his basic second law, which states that force is equal to a mass times an acceleration. And he says that the gravitational force between two objects of mass 1 and mass 2, denoted by m1 and m2, that force F is equal to m1 times m2 divided by the square of the distance between them multiplied by a constant, which is generally denoted by capital G. In high school we used to call it big G, known as the gravitational constant. Yippee! Very good. MashaAllah. You have mathematically described, more or less, what is supposed to be going on. And then from this we get Kepler's laws that describe the paths that these heavenly bodies can take. And if you write them in those equations of Kepler in polar form, then from that you can derive that there are only certain trajectories that are possible in the heavens. And lo and behold, they turn out to be those of the conic sections. A circle, ellipse, parabola, or hyperbola. So you can only have a circular so-called trajectory, elliptic, or an orbit, an elliptic orbit. You can have a parabolic trajectory and a hyperbolic trajectory, one half of the hyperbola. Okay, great. How do they move? The human being moves according to, it's an act of volition. There's various physiological processes involved, etc. It moves. A car moves in a certain way. It has an internal combustion engine. Maybe you have a Tesla. It has an electrical motor. Planes, jet planes, they have a jet engine. Propeller-driven planes have propellers. Gliders glide. I mean, how? Where's the explanation? There's a book over there. Why don't you grab it? There's 3 of them on the very edge of there. Actually, I only need this one. The whole problem of how things move is a very old one. There's an entire volume by the eminent scholar of ancient philosophy, Richard Sorabji, entitled Matter, Space, and Motion, Theories in Antiquity and Their Sequel. These were huge problems for the scholastics in Europe and for Islamic philosophers. There's also a very interesting study by Barbara M. Sattler, The Concept of Motion in Ancient Greek Thought, Foundations in Logic, Method, and Mathematics. And if you look at these ancient paradoxes that go back to Zeno of Elea, if that's how it's pronounced, then there is a connection between motion, time, and the continuum. Another fascinating book of that name by Richard Sorabji. So these matters are far from settled, and to think that just because Descartes came along and gave us the Cartesian coordinate system, and Newton and Leibniz gave us calculus, and he wrote the Principia, and Kepler came up with the Kepler's laws, and we have Copernicus, that somehow it's all been solved. You are wrong. It has not.
So why is it not enough then? to say that the heavens move in a parabola or a hyperbola.
How do they move? How?
Is there no way to answer
that question? Is there a jet engine inside Jupiter that's propelling it around? How is it moving?
Mm-hmm. Is there no way to mathematically explain how or why?
It's not in the equations. We just described the motion.
Uh-huh.
The why question, the how question is not answered.
That's a question that has to be answered outside of
science. Now they will make fun of the ancients, and they'll say, well, that the motive force in the universe was ishq, or love. That's one way they explained it. In other ways, they talked about how there is an angel associated with each heavenly body.
It has to be a metaphysical explanation.
It has to be a metaphysical explanation. I mean, if there is a physical one, ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome. You are welcome. O scientists of the world, explain to me how these heavenly bodies move. Cannot. So far, they haven't done it. The jury is out, as they say. And so, Genon very rightly says, further down on page 97, mechanism is limited to giving a simple description of movement, such as it is in its outward appearance, but is powerless to grasp the reason for it, and so to express its essential or qualitative aspect, which alone can afford a real explanation. These considerations apply with even greater force in the case of things that may be more complex in character than movement, and where quality may be more predominant over quantity. And that is why a science constituted mechanistically cannot actually be of any value in terms of effective knowledge, even within the confines of the relative and limited domain that encloses it. A modern philosopher whom I am quite fond of, Mortimer J. Adler, when he was associated with the University of Chicago in the massive project of the Encyclopedia Britannica and producing the Great Books of the Western World series. Who else was there? There was another important figure. Anyway, it's not important. There was another important figure that was involved at that project. And when they put together this big set of great books of the Western world, he had a kind of an index. I forget what that volume was called.
The Syntopticon.
The Syntopticon.
Yeah.
Of the key ideas. And in alphabetical order, they list these key ideas, and they employed real people. This was no so-called artificial intelligence. This is before the era of computers as we know them today. And they went through and they indexed these books. And so that's really the useful aspect of that set, if you have it. Mm-hmm. Even if, you have the internet. Oh boy, the great internet. And one of the first entries in that is angels. And he wanted to include this, and the rest of the people, I think, in the committee or whatever institutional structure was set up, they had strong opposition to him including this, because they considered this to be a complete superstition. They considered this to be outmoded ideas. Materialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The
illusion of ordinary life. That's the next chapter. Solidification. That's in chapter 17 in this book. So the solidification of the world, this complete sort of cutting off of human beings from the domain of the supernatural. Here when I say supernatural, I don't mean like horror movies and the kind of themes that are there, but simply that which is above the purely natural order, or the realm of at-tabi'a in Arabic, or the realm of the natural order, the realm of the physical universe. Mm-hmm. And then later he went on and he speaks in some summary fashion about this, when he later decided to devote an entire book called Angels, entitled The Angels and Us. So if you're interested, you may follow up and read about that further there.
So if it's completely if you cannot materialistically account for it to the modern, it just doesn't exist, simply.
What, motion?
No, angels. If something like angels.
No, he'll say, show them to me. Where are they? Can you capture one in a net?
Yeah, unless you can corporeally account for it.
Like catching a dog in a net. Or a bird in a snare.
So in a sense, it just doesn't exist.
Can you empirically show me that they exist? Will an angel show up on an X-ray, a radar, an MRI?
Yeah.
Because they're willing to admit that there are things which are not visible to the human eye. Well, then say, show it to me under a microscope, or show me evidence of it in a nuclear accelerator, in a bubble chamber, in a particle accelerator. In other words, all of these means of measurement are merely extensions of the five senses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can we detect the presence of an angel here by using, for example, a Geiger counter?
Or electromagnetic. I've seen that on ghost shows. They'll try and detect ghosts through electromagnetic detectors.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's sort of what is at work here. So Descartes, looks at everything as in this way, in terms of mechanism, and the concept of Cartesian dualism is also important. So let's say a few words about that. So Guénon doesn't really go into these things. He expects you to know these things. Where is the... Yes. In these little treatises of Descartes, we have Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. He talks about this in this book. But rather than just quoting from there, this has to do with really what is today called philosophy of mind. And I would refer you to this book by Edward Feser. This is a very accessible book, simply called Philosophy of Mind. It's a beginner's guide. That's the subtitle, Philosophy of Mind, a beginner's guide. And there's a whole chapter on dualism, Cartesian dualism. So on page 19, basically what is involved in Cartesian dualism is the distinction between body and mind. Descartes' dualism, and this is a direct quote from Feser, his claim that there is a real distinction between the mind and the body, that they are fundamentally different kinds of things, is quite in line with it. Well, you have to read the previous paragraph, but that is not important for us. We reflexively distinguish between mind and body in ordinary contexts as often as in philosophical ones, and in a way that implies that the difference between them goes deeper than a mere difference between part and whole. We do not, after all, distinguish equally naturally between hand and body, or even brain and body. Moreover, and this is very important, the metaphysical content of most religions has historically included some version of the idea that a human being has a soul. Now, the soul is not a material thing. You cannot measure it. It doesn't show up on a CAT scan or an MRI or a positron emission tomography or X-rays or radar detectors and so on and so forth. So there's an idea of the soul regarded as the seat of our mental lives, as spiritual rather than physical, and surviving the death of the body. Descartes' position is intended rationally to systematize and justify this common sense view of human nature. It is naturally enough referred to as Cartesian dualism. In Descartes' view, the reason mind and body seem different in the ways sketched in the previous chapter in this book of Feser's is that they are different and radically so. The body is in its intrinsic nature exactly like every other material object, being a res extens. In other words, being an essentially extended thing. In Latin, this is called res extens or res extensa, extended in space. That is to say, and defined by such properties as, again, their quantities, length, depth, height, mass, motion, and spatial location. Together with other material or extended objects, it is composed of purely physical parts. Molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles, and governed entirely by the causal processes enshrined in the laws of physics. The body and the vast physical universe of which it is a part are best thought of through the model of a machine. This is very important. Machines in the time of Descartes were not terribly sophisticated. They were mechanical contraptions. You didn't have avionics or fly-by-wire or electronic controls. They were mechanical controls. They'd be connected by wires, screws, and so on and so forth. There was a direct connection. There were no electric motors and sensors and controllers involved like we have in many modern machines, and of course integrated circuits and so on and so forth. So that is what it meant in terms of the entire universe being a machine. We also speak because of Newton figured out the laws of the machine. So the universe is the Newtonian world machine. The body and the vast physical universe of which it is a part are best thought of through the model of a machine, their operations being as mechanically automatic as those of a watch, and their elements as brute and unthinking as a watch's gears and mainspring. The mind, by contrast, is essentially a thinking thing, or a res cogitans. That is Cartesian dualism. Res extensa, res cogitans. The mind, by contrast, is essentially a thinking thing, devoid of shape, mass, location in space, or any other physical property, and governed by reason rather than mechanical causation. It is utterly distinct from its associated human body as it is from the material world in general, though it does interact with it. So this dualism causes these problems. This is the Cartesian dualism that Aganon is talking about. And so even though Descartes would admit that the mind is an immaterial thing, he's basically dispensed with the traditional notion of the soul. Now, he thinks he's doing a service. I mean, we have to be fair. Descartes was not an atheist, but he's certainly not anything like the theists who were there a century before him, or 2 centuries before him, or the theists in the Islamic world, for example. So, where did we leave off? We said that Descartes reduced the whole nature of bodies to extension. And he considered extension, again, only from a purely quantitative point of view. Length, width, etc. Depth, mass. And even at that time, just like the most recent mechanists and the materialists, he made no difference in this connection between so-called inorganic bodies and living beings. Living beings are specified and not organized bodies only, because the being itself is in effect reduced by him to the body alone, in accordance with the all-too-famous Cartesian theory of animal machines. And this is really one of the most astonishing absurdities ever engendered by the systematic spirit. So he introduces this dualism, so there's this mind-body dualism. Then how is the mind connected to the body? Because you've got rid of the soul, and the entire... and obliterated the entire edifice of traditional psychology, which was actually part of physics in ancient philosophy. Was the culmination of physics, was the study of the soul. So everything is reduced to this machine sort of sense. I would like to adduce give a few examples, but before we do that, we simply would like to make the point that this dualism leads to a mechanistic physics, which inexorably leads to and paves the way toward materialism. The reduction to the quantitative, this is the bottom of paragraph, last paragraph on page 98, or actually, let's go back before that. We talked about the animal machines, and Descartes and Guénon talks about how ridiculous this is. He says further on, as an inescapable result of dualism, the human being is, as it were, cut into 2 parts that do not become reunited and cannot form a real composite whole. In other words, they are mind and body, since they cannot enter into mutual communication by any means, being supposed to be absolutely heterogeneous. So this also later leads to this ideas that our mind that we don't really perceive the world. Our mind creates images of the world. You find ideas like this. You find doctors like this of this kind in Hume, in Kant, much later. So there's really no effective action by one on the other. It's impossible To complete the picture, Ganon continues, an attempt was made to explain mechanically all the phenomena that take place in animals, including those manifestations that are most obviously psychic in character. It is reasonable to ask why the same explanation should not apply to man, and whether it may be not permissible to ignore the other side of dualism as contributing nothing to the explanation of things. So the later developments of this in the modern world is they try and explain everything as brain chemistry.
Yeah. Happiness is dopamine.
Happiness is dopamine. There's all this discussion of this hormone and that hormone, and adrenaline, all this kind of... In other words, again, if it's not directly mechanical, it is mechanical, chemical, physiological. Mm-hmm. Again, what is all that? Materialism. It's on the level of matter.
Mm-hmm.
From this stage to the stage of looking at that other side as a useless complication, and in practice treating it as non-existent, and thence to the point of denying it purely and simply, is no long step, especially for men whose attention is constantly turned toward the domain of perception, as in the case with modern Westerners. Thus it is that Descartes' mechanistic physics could not but pave the way for materialism. So this is what Descartes did. And Descartes basically then brings the entire world under a kind of materialistic worldview. And of course, this is all brought down to the level of quantity. And this is the mindset which has now taken over the world. And in a kind of gradual segue into the next chapter, Ganon talks about this mindset, which results in what the next chapter is, the title of the next chapter, what he calls the illusion of ordinary life, or the illusion of ordinary life, the illusion of ordinary life. So he says that comes about because there is another kind of subtle materialism. So there is the avowed and formal materialism, as he calls it, second paragraph, page 99. He says there's also what may be termed, he says, a factual materialism. Now, what does he mean by factual materialism? Well, first of all, he says that this factual materialism has a much broader and deeper influence than the avowed formal materialism. What does he mean? He says, the influence of which extends much further afield, for many people who regard themselves as being by no means materialists, nonetheless behave as such in practice in all circumstances. So by factual materialism, he means like a de facto materialism. There are plenty of people who claim to be religious, who attend church or synagogue or temple or go to the masjid regularly, but they are de facto materialists. I've had many conversations with people in the Muslim community who sometimes ask me about this, that, or the other thing. And I say, well, there's a possibility that there might be an evil eye on you. There could be a curse. Someone may have done some magic on you, black magic. It happens. And they'll say, yes, but how is that possible? And these are people who pray 5 times a day, I presume. They if you ask them, they would say, yes, we believe in Islam. We profess the Shahada.
They say they believe in God.
We read the Quran. We believe in God.
Yeah. Which implies that they believe in something metaphysical, but really...
But they don't really understand the implication of that. And if you would accuse them of being materialist, they would get very upset. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, and perhaps this is not their fault, but they live in an environment, they swim, as it were, in a sea of materialism. Mm. And that is the de facto worldview. That's what they have been taught in school. Yeah. If you live in the United States and you attend public school, that's what you're going to be taught. And even if you attend some of these fancy schmancy Islamic schools like Brighter Horizons in Dallas, Texas,
Even worse condition.
Do you think they teach you any classes on metaphysics there?
No, absolutely
they just
not.
teach the
They think it's bid'ah.
same curriculum, whatever the particular curriculum is that George Bush instituted in the state of Texas, or whatever was No Child Left Behind, whatever it was called. Whatever the state has, school board, whatever.
In a lot of ways, they don't even have a choice because the place could shut down.
So the only difference then is that they take a break for Jumu'ah prayers or something,
and they have
halal food in the cafeteria, and they have a religion class, and they got
occasional
a
Quran class,
guy that teaches them Quran X hours, a week. So I've come across such people, and then if I tell them, well, I can tell you that I know that someone has done magic on you. And they'll say, well, how do you know? And then you explain to them, well, you do this, that, and the other thing. So, well, how is that possible? But if you had a machine, like a CAT scan, and if you charged them $700 and sent them through there and through a bunch of magnets that made a lot of noise, and they had to be in there for 35 minutes and going half crazy in that disgusting tube, and then you come out, and then you tell them yes, then maybe they would believe you.
Yeah.
So this is the situation. You have people who are de facto materialists. And so such people are de facto materialists. There is in fact a relationship, writes Guénon, between these two materialisms, rather like that referred to earlier between philosophical rationalism and popular rationalism, except that the merely factual materialist does not generally parade that quality and would often protest if it were attributed to him, whereas the popular rationalist, even when he is philosophically the most ignorant of men, is all the more anxious to proclaim himself a rationalist, while at the same time he proudly adorns himself with the title of free thinker, all unconscious of irony, for all the time he is but the slave of all the current prejudices of his period. So we have many people of that type walking around. And these tendencies are the very foundation of the modern spirit. They are the very basis of the illusion of ordinary life. And it is thus, Guénon says on page 100, in fact he says, in this sort of way, in this sort of subtle way, he means, does anti-traditional action succeed in using to its own profit even those who ought to be its adversaries, and who might be so, if the deviation of the modern mentality had not so shaped things that they are full of contradictions, yet incapable even of becoming aware of the fact. Here again, the tendency to uniformity finds its realization, since in practice all men end by thinking and acting in the same way, and the things in respect of which they nevertheless still differ have no more than a minimum of influence, and are not translated into any reality in the outer world. Thus, in such a world, and with the rarest exceptions, a man who professes himself a Christian, says Guénon, or a Muslim, or, I would say, some other genuine faith tradition, does not fail to behave in practice as if there were no reality whatever outside corporeal existence alone. And a priest who does a little science does not differ perceptibly from a university materialist. When things have reached this stage, have they much further to go before the lowest point of the descent is reached at last? That's the conclusion of the chapter, and it's very, very profound. Most religious people today, most people, I would say, who profess outwardly a religion, who proclaim their allegiance to a particular community of faith, to a revealed religion, are, in fact, in their day-to-day actions, materialists. Now, regarding this whole, yes,
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
He quotes Descartes a lot. A lot of this work is based on refuting Descartes, or the last few chapters, and Descartes in the Meditations is relying throughout the Meditations on his power of reasoning. Right?
That's correct.
To remove the skeptical doubts that he raises, but to do so, as he says in the first meditation, it requires that he exempt at least some of the propositions obtained through reasoning from the doubts that he raised in the first meditation about the epistemic reliability of one's faculty. So in a sense, he almost acknowledges that there's a problem.
Yeah. Back in meditation 1.
Yeah. The Cartesian reply would be, I found this really interesting statement attributed to Luther.
Martin Luther.
That I paraphrased, where he says, "Here I stand as a philosopher, with confidence in reasoning, and as such I can do no other." That we have almost no choice but to rely on our reasoning. And then to shift my question into Genon's argument, which is that whatever Descartes says, he almost cannot save what he has set in motion, that ultimately no matter what he tries to do, it will lead to materialism and a reduction to body. Mm-hmm. I'm just struggling to see how Descartes' conception of reason and his reliance on reason, even against his will, almost leads to a reduction to body and almost a complete, you don't even need body at that point. How do you understand the question?
I'm not entirely sure that I do.
How is it that mind is ultimately reduced to body and only body?
Because he has no explanation for it, because he's dispensed with the notion of the soul. I mean, Cartesian dualism cannot solve the problem of the qualia, as it's known.
What is that?
You immediately are. How do you explain your qualitative states? You're immediately aware of the various sensations. Where do those sensations take place? And again, they'll try bring in some sort of, I suppose, neurological explanation. But that dualistic concept, in other words, you've completely rejected the traditional notions of psychology, of the different faculties of the soul, which is a big part of what Book 3 of De Anima is about, and to which Muslim philosophers like Ibn Sina and then later many other figures devoted a great deal of space. And they would all acknowledge that the human being is more than just the body. And in fact, the human being, by his very nature, is defined, literally defined, by the possession of the rational soul. But Descartes' use of reason is actually unreasonable, inasmuch as if we go back to the previous chapter, rationalism, it's the misuse of reason. It's not seeing its limitation. And that there are things again beyond it, because rationalism again denies anything of the suprasensible order. And so we're sort of leading into the next chapter about the illusion of ordinary life, but people reduce human life to merely material concerns, material and material pursuits. There's nothing else. And for people of a previous age, there's no understanding of this. I myself don't understand it, and I was born in the modern period. I remember when I went to school in junior high, and I looked around the people. I mean, I thought they live essentially in a completely different universe than I do.
Yeah,
completely different. And it's not just you say, oh well, it's just a question of worldview or point of view. It's not. They have no understanding of the idea of the supernatural, none whatsoever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is revealing himself all the time, everywhere, at every instant. But they're blind to that.
Because it's not material. So you have to shift your way of looking at things.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. I want to say a few things about mechanism and materialism. So this idea of the animal machine. There's a very interesting book called The Secret Teachings of Plants. Peculiar title, The Secret Teachings of Plants. The subtitle is The Intelligence of the Heart in the Direct Perception of Nature by Stephen Harrod Buhner, Buhner. Barron Company, Rochester, Vermont, 2004. This is a very strange book. In a good way. Strange in the sense of ajib. The Arabic word ajib means strange, also means marvelous. I first heard of this book many years back when I was living in the United Arab Emirates from an acquaintance of mine who had come across this book, and he, because of his work, he traveled a lot on long-haul international flights. And he had picked up this book and read it on some long-haul flight, and he had, touched down in UAE and said, you really must read this book. And when he first said The Secret Teaching of Plants, I said, Well, I don't have anything against gardening, but, it's not really something I do. So, no, you have no idea how this is. You really need to look at this book. It's not about gardening. So I can't really explain the peculiar title, but suffice it to say that it is a book about the natural order, and he has a lot to say about the nature of the human heart. So I'll leave you to investigate the book in more detail, but the point I'm trying to make here is as follows. On page 75, and he discusses a great deal about modern physiology and cardiology. Under the heading, The Non-Pumping Heart, he says, and I quote, "The traditional view of the heart," traditional here with a small t, not capital T, in other words, he means since Descartes in the Western world, the traditional view, small t, of the heart as a pump was engineered out of the 19th century fascination with steam engines. And of course, that goes all the way back to Descartes and mechanism, right? Materialism. It is merely a mechanical model of the heart and its function that reflects the reductionistic linear thinking of Euclid and Newton. I think I wouldn't say Euclid as such, but anyhow, we don't want to quibble on small points here. In that model, the steam engine or heart is the worker that provides motive force. The water or blood is simply a passive, non-living substance that is forced around the system by the pump's activity. But deeper contemplation shows, and even in the 19th century, that the heart, as powerful as it is not really the pump it is supposed to be. The blood is not propelled by pressure, but rather moves with its own biological momentum and with its own intrinsic flow pattern. Modern analysis of the heart has shown that in spite of the fact that the most powerful ventricle of the heart can shoot water 6 feet into the air, that's an approximation, the amount of pressure actually needed to force the blood through the entire length of the body's blood vessels would have to be able to lift a 100-pound weight 1 mile high. So it's not just mechanical. The heart is simply incapable of producing the pressure actually needed to circulate blood. The heart is in reality not the pump of the circulatory system, but plays a much more subtle and elegant role, for the heart does not pump the blood. The blood, counterintuitively, moves of its own accord. When chicken embryos are closely examined, I'm just continuing to read from this book, it turns out that their blood begins to flow in a regular circulating pattern before the heart has developed sufficiently to begin pumping it. And the blood does not flow like water through a hose. That's what you would think. It is not a simple stream flowing through a tube, but instead is something much more elegant. This is a long extract, but I'm doing this to make a point, and I think it's an important point. Blood flow through embryo vessels is instead composed of 2 streams. And these 2 streams spiral around one another in the direction of flow. Nor do these streams flow at a regular rate. Their rates together and separately vary, sometimes significantly, and this difference in flow rates is one of the causes of changes in the temperature of the blood from moment to moment. The thermal fluctuations from varying rates of friction. The faster the flow, the more friction, and the higher the temperature. At the center of these spiraling streams, there is nothing. A vacuum. In fact, blood flow through living vessels is much more like a tornado than anything else. It is a vortex circling around a vacuum center. At all times, up to 1/3 of the space occupied by the bloodstream is a void, a vacuum. Such a vacuum is necessary for producing a vortex. I could read more and more and more. This goes on for pages. This is a very, very profound book. So that is just one example of how this, shall we call it, the Cartesian mechanistic worldview that is there in modern science, especially in the health sciences and physiology, for example, has led to all kinds of problems. Finally, I would like to speak about the philosophy of matter. There is a very profound work by Edward Feser entitled Aristotle's Revenge, The Metaphysical Foundations of Physical and Biological Science. It's a very interesting book. I should state for the record that in Feser's book Against Atheism, The Last Superstition, It's a good book. He does make some disparaging remarks about Islam. He is a Catholic. Most Catholics are very nice people, and they want to have dialogue with Muslims, and they recognize the indebtedness of people like Aquinas to Muslim scholars like Avicenna. But on the other hand, others have various views. He also says some really idiotic things about the Kennedy assassination, in surprisingly, in a book against atheism. So even extremely intelligent people can say strange things. But, we have to be fair. For them, he doesn't have to like Islam. I don't have to like Christianity, for that matter. But we have to be fair. And al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he receives it and accepts it. So he has a very interesting treatment in this book in chapter 5 called The Philosophy of Matter. Section 5.1, does physics capture all there is to matter? So I'm going to just read some extracts from this as well that are pertinent to the theme. There's a lot to say here. So he talks about how philosophers who are sensitive to the highly abstract character of modern physics description of the world, and as much as it is grounded in mathematical abstractions, that this description of the world often puts special emphasis on how little physics really tells us about the nature of matter. And he has some very interesting quotations from none other than Bertrand Russell, where Russell talks about how matter is retreated into the background. He says, he's quoting one of the works of Bertrand Russell, all that I know, this is page 307, quoting Bertrand Russell, all that I know about matter is what I can infer by means of certain abstract postulates about the purely logical attributes of its space-time distribution. Prima facie, these tell me nothing whatever about its other characteristics. Similarly, Michael Lockwood argues that physics characterizations of material phenomena are topic neutral in the sense that they represent physical attributes only in the mode of whatever it is that occupies the relevant positions within a certain causal structure. So, Fazer explains this with a very nice example. He's very good at analogies. He said, if I tell you the rules of checkers, you will be able to figure out that a checkers game board will have squares of different colors on it. That the game pieces all will be movable from one square to another and so forth, but the rules will not tell you whether the board will be made out of cardboard and the pieces made of plastic, what color the board and pieces will be, etc. Similarly, physics tells us about different types of particles, their spatiotemporal relations, their causal roles and the like, but it does not tell us the intrinsic nature of the entities that bear these relations to one another and play these roles. How do the planets move? How do atoms move? How is it that subatomic particles are in movement? How does the electron really move around the nucleus, if indeed it does? The abstract mathematical character of physics is part of the reason for this. Simon Blackburn elaborates on the point by noting that when formulating conservation laws, physics must make use of predicates that apply across different possible realizations of the feature being predicated of a system. For example, the physicist must characterize temperature in a way that applies across changes of state from solid to liquid to gas. This applicability across different possible realizations requires that a predicate be formulated in terms of the functional role of the feature being predicated rather than its intrinsic nature. Again, what is the intrinsic nature of things? The thing that plays the role. Hence, in seeking unifying features or patterns that persist across the evolution of systems, physics deals only in roles. It is role-seeking all the way down. As John Foster argues, he's citing various people. I can't give you the citations because he doesn't use footnotes. He uses this horrible method of, he just says the name and you give the year. I hate that method of citation. Hate it. Anyway, that's what he uses. As John Foster argues, 1982, pages 64 to 67, whatever that means, physics' inability to reveal matters' intrinsic nature. Physics' inability to reveal matters' intrinsic nature also reflects the nature of the empirical testing of physical theories. Spatiotemporal relations, causal roles, and the like are all that can be tested by way of making empirical predictions. Hence, suppose we are trying to decide whether to affirm the existence of a particle of type A versus a particle of type B, where A and B have exactly the same causal roles, spatiotemporal relations, and other topic-neutral features, and differ only in their intrinsic nature. Then there will be no empirical test to determine for any particle we discover that exhibits those features whether it is of type A or B. Thus, concludes Foster, beyond its topic-neutral features, matter is empirically inscrutable. I took a lot of physics when I was in high school and college. We don't really talk about matter. We talk about mass. Mass, we were told, is the measure of matter. It's how much stuff is there. What the stuff is, in many physics problems, doesn't matter. No pun intended. That's the business of chemistry. From the point of view of mechanics, if you throw a ball, it doesn't really matter if it's made of iron or rubber or what have you, because in mechanics you're just trying to describe the motion of the ball. If you're interested in whether if it's made of iron or whether it's made of plastic, that's a question left for chemistry. In chemistry, we were taught, and when I was in high school and later in university as well, that chemistry really is the study of matter. And so you have different sorts of substances, and they form compounds. You have molecules, you have this, you have that, you have the periodic table of the elements. There's 92 naturally occurring elements. You learn about all their different properties, how they combine, and so on and so forth. Unsurprisingly, then, the concept of matter as such does not actually play much of a role in modern physics. As Ernan McMullen has written, the concept of matter faded out of science, leaving only its grin, so to speak, behind. It plays no direct part in the doing of science today. It still plays a part, albeit a tenuous and difficult to define one, in talking about science and its implications. In the 17th century, the term matter lost much of its significance for the working scientist because, one, from Descartes' time onwards, people, from Descartes' time onward, it was used more and more as an empty but convenient general term to denote the objects of physical science without any sort of commitment as to the nature of these objects. Newtonian mechanics substituted mass. What did I just say earlier? Newtonian mechanics substituted mass for matter in its analysis of the causes of motion. The term matter does not occur. Consequently, in any physical theory today, one finds no symbol corresponding to it in the equations of 20th century physics. The result is that in most modern languages, matter is a vacuous term denoting simply that which is accessible to empirical investigation. To say that something is matter or material in this broad sense, or in this broad usage, therefore, is to say no more than it is part of the physical world. Nothing whatever is conveyed about the properties of the entity so labeled. Very interesting. So, from Descartes, because of Cartesian dualism, because everything is either res cogitans or res extensa, because then we are only looking at things which are extended in space, we are only approaching things from a rational point of view, this inexorably leads to this notion of mechanism, and this inexorably leads to materialism. And now, several centuries on, we see that the notion of matter itself is merely a cipher, a dogma. There's nothing truly behind it. We'll leave it at that and pick up with chapter 15, the illusion of ordinary life. Thank you for watching.